Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down two of the most fundamental concepts in political science, politics and ideology. Now, they might sound like these big, abstract terms, but trust me, they're the invisible forces shaping everything from your news feed to your future. And really getting a handle on them is the key to understanding the world around us. So let's kick things off with a big question, one that brings us all home for you. How does any of this stuff actually relate to your life? Politics isn't just something that happens in faraway government buildings. It's about the rules, the resources, and the opportunities that define your life right now and what they're going to look like down the road. So here's our game plan. First, we'll get into why politics is so deeply personal. Then, we'll nail down some key definitions before we map out the whole ideological spectrum. After that, we're going to see these ideas in action with a real-world case study, and then finally, we'll bring it all back to you and help you think about your own framework. Okay, let's dive right into our first section. We all have these beliefs that just feel like common sense. But have you ever stopped to ask yourself, where does that feeling of what's normal or what's right actually come from? Well, here's the thing. The reason politics feels so personal is because it's driven by ideologies. These are incredibly powerful systems of belief that basically frame our entire reality. And a lot of the time, we don't even notice it's happening. They make certain ways of organizing society seem totally natural, when really, they're just choices. All right, so to really get a grip on this, we need to get our vocabulary straight. Let's get really precise with our language, starting with the big one, politics. The classic definition of politics really boils down to this: power and distribution. Who gets what, when, and how? It's about who has the power and how resources and rights get handed out. And what's fascinating is that even the Nepali term, Rajniti, reflects this deep history, literally meaning something like the ethics or policy of kings. Ideology, on the other hand, is the why behind the what of politics. So if politics is the process, ideology is the blueprint. It's that whole set of ideas that tells a group how society should work. But that raises a huge question, right? How does one blueprint become the default design for an entire society? How do certain ideas get so popular they just feel like common sense? Well, the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci had a really powerful concept to explain exactly that. He called it hegemony. And this is key. It's not rule by force, it's rule by consent. It's the way a society comes to accept a certain way of doing things, like the idea of a 40-hour work week or the dream of owning a home, as just normal or natural, even if that system mostly benefits a particular group. It's all the ideas we absorb through media, school, and culture that keep the status quo chugging along. Now that we've got our core concepts down, let's see how they all fit together. How can we possibly organize all these different blueprints for society? Well, a really common starting point is the political spectrum. Now, I gotta say, this spectrum isn't a perfect model of political thinking. It's way more complicated than a simple line. But it's an incredibly useful tool for just getting started, for mapping out where different ideologies stand in relation to one another. This table gives us a kind of simplified map. Over on the far left, you have an ideology like communism, which calls for a total restructuring of society. As you move toward the middle, you get socialism and social democracy. Then on the center right, there's conservatism, and way out on the far right, you find ideologies like fascism. So what's the fundamental difference here? Well, if we're speaking broadly, the left wing tends to put high value on things like collective equality and social justice, and they often see the state as a tool to achieve that. The right wing, on the other hand, tends to prioritize individual liberty, tradition, and a more limited role for government, with a big emphasis on private ownership. And here are four of the heavy hitters you'll run into constantly. You've got liberalism, which is all about individual freedom. Then there's conservatism, which wants to preserve traditions. Socialism, which aims to shrink inequality through collective action. And nationalism, which puts the nation first and foremost. Each one gives a totally different answer to that basic question of who gets what and why. Now, abstract definitions are great and all, but let's make this really concrete. How does all this theory actually play out on the ground? Let's zoom in and take a look at a specific country, Nepal. You can't really understand a country's politics without looking at a map. And Nepal's location, squeezed between these two massive powers, has had a profound impact on its history, its alliances, and its internal political battles. And wow, Nepal's recent history is just this incredible story of ideological struggle. You can see the power of democratic and socialist ideas in the movement that ended the Rana regime. Then a far-left Maoist ideology fueled a decade-long civil war. And that all led to the eventual transformation from a 240-year-old monarchy into a republic. These weren't random events, they were battles between totally different visions for the country. And you can see that history reflected directly in its modern political scene. The major political parties today tend to fall on the left and center-left of the spectrum, and that's a direct legacy of those historical movements. For instance, the Nepali Congress Party, with its social democratic platform, has historically pushed for things like a mixed economy and a welfare state. Okay, so here's the real kicker. These massive, large-scale ideological battles don't just shape nations, they shape us as individuals. They shape the very way you see the world. Look, every single one of us has an ideological framework, whether we know it or not. It gets built piece by piece over our entire lives, influenced by our families, the schools we go to, the media we consume, and our communities. And the very first step to becoming a true critical thinker is just recognizing that those influences are there. So if you take anything away from this, let it be these three things. Number one, politics is the process of deciding who gets what. 2, ideology is the blueprint that guides those decisions. And 3, these blueprints aren't just abstract theories. They have real, tangible impacts on everything, from a nation's history to our own personal lives. And we'll end with one last thing for you to think about. Take a minute and consider the ideas you just take for granted. How did the dominant ideologies in your own society, the ones that just feel like common sense, how do they shape your unexamined assumptions about the world? Because thinking about that, well, that's the first step to truly understanding politics.